Let me start with something that caught almost everyone off guard. Mamdani, who campaigned as the worst nightmare for President Trump, was suddenly walking through the front doors of the White House, not for a fight, but for a meeting, a friendly one. And the reaction? Shock, confusion, headlines scrambling to make sense of it. Some commentators calling it a backtrack, others calling it strategy, and still others wondering whether we're watching the start of the biggest political recalibration in New York City in decades. But here's what stood out most. The tone inside the Oval Office was nothing like the fiery rhetoric both men used on the campaign trail. Instead, it was almost warm, cooperative, even optimistic. And that raises the real question, why? Why would two leaders who seemed destined to clash suddenly sit down, smile, shake hands, and talk about affordability, safety, and the future of America's biggest city? Today, I'm breaking down exactly what happened behind those closed doors, what reporters saw, what cameras captured, what both men said afterward, and why the political landscape may have shifted more in one afternoon than most expected in an entire year. Now, to understand why this meeting mattered so much, we need to rewind just a bit. Because the man sitting across from President Trump in that historic office wasn't just any mayor-elect. He was someone who had spent months on the campaign trail calling the Trump administration everything from a nightmare to a fascist regime. Strong words. Words that energized a progressive base in New York City and helped propel him to victory. But once the confetti settled and the reality of governing set in, something changed. Within days of winning, Zoran Mamdani, who had promised to relentlessly pursue every avenue to oppose Trump, picked up the phone and requested a meeting at the White House. Not to protest, not to grandstand, but to talk, to find common ground, to work together on issues that matter to millions of New Yorkers. Now, if you're like me, your first thought might be, what happened? What shifted so dramatically between Election Day and that phone call? And, more importantly, what does it tell us about the difference between campaigning and governing? Because here's the thing. When you're running for office, you can afford to be bold. You can make sweeping promises. You can draw sharp lines in the sand and paint your opponent as the villain in a story where you're the hero. That's politics. That's how you rally people, how you get them excited, how you win votes. But once you actually win, once you're the one sitting in the chair, staring at budgets and federal funding reports and legal constraints, that's when reality hits. And reality, my friends, has a way of humbling even the most passionate idealists. Mamdani learned this lesson faster than most, because the promises he made on the campaign trail weren't small, they were massive, transformational. The kind of proposals that sound incredible in a speech but require billions of dollars and political capital to actually execute. Let me walk you through what he promised, because it's important context for understanding why that White House meeting became not just smart but necessary. First, free buses. Not reduced fares, not discounted passes for seniors or students, completely free public transit across one of the largest and most expensive transit systems in the world. The estimated cost? Somewhere in the range of several $100 million annually, funded by, well, that part was always a bit fuzzy. Second, free childcare. Universal, citywide childcare for families who need it. A noble goal, no question. But again, the price tag would run into the billions, and the infrastructure required to deliver it doesn't just appear overnight. Third, and perhaps most controversial, freezing rent for over 2 million rent-stabilized apartments across the city on day one. No increases, no adjustments for inflation or rising costs. Just a hard freeze. Landlords would still have to pay property taxes, maintenance, insurance, utilities, all of which continue to rise, but their rental income would stay locked in place. Now, I don't need to tell you what happens when costs go up, but revenue doesn't. Either the landlord eats the loss, which very few can afford to do indefinitely, or they stop investing in the property. Repairs get delayed. Buildings deteriorate. In the worst cases, properties get abandoned or sold off, creating a downward spiral in housing quality. But Mamdani didn't stop there. He also proposed city-built housing, essentially having New York City itself become a developer and landlord. and city-run grocery stores to combat what he called food deserts in underserved neighborhoods. Again, ambitious, again, expensive, and again, requiring infrastructure, staff, regulatory approval, and funding sources that don't yet exist. So how is he planning to pay for all of this? Taxes. Specifically, raising corporate taxes and imposing higher income taxes on millionaires and high earners. He argued that wealthier neighborhoods, and yes, he did describe them in terms that sounded race-based, though he later clarified he meant it geographically, should shoulder more of the burden to fund services for lower-income communities. Now, here's where the plan hit its first major roadblock. New York City can't just raise state taxes on its own. That power belongs to the governor and the state legislature. And Governor Kathy Hochul made it very clear, very quickly, that she wasn't on board. No new taxes, not for this, not now. Suddenly, the funding mechanism for Mamdani's entire agenda vanished. Poof. Gone. And without it, every one of those big promises became just that, promises. Words on a website. Applause lines from a campaign rally. But the problem didn't end there. Because as Mamdani's team started digging into the numbers, they realized something else. New York City receives tens of billions of dollars in federal funding every year. Funding for infrastructure, for housing programs, for public safety, for education, and a significant portion of that funding flows through or is influenced by the White House. If Mamdani came into office guns blazing, treating Trump as an enemy, publicly opposing every federal initiative, creating friction at every turn, well, there was a very real risk that some of that funding could slow down, or get redirected, or simply not get renewed. And in a city already facing budget pressures, losing even a fraction of federal support could be catastrophic. So Mamdani found himself in a bind. He'd won his election by promising to be Trump's worst nightmare, but actually being Trump's nightmare might destroy his ability to govern effectively. It might cost New York billions. It might make it impossible to deliver on any of his promises, even the scaled-back ones. That's when the pivot happened. Quietly at first, advisors telling him he needed to be pragmatic. Political veterans warning him that confrontation without leverage is just noise. Fiscal analysts showing him the numbers, the dependencies, the risks. And so, the phone call was made, the meeting was requested, and President Trump, to his credit, said yes. Now, I want you to imagine what that meeting must have felt like. Two men who had spent months, maybe years, criticizing each other, sitting across from each other in one of the most powerful rooms in the world. Cameras rolling, reporters watching, both knowing that what happened next would define not just their working relationship, but possibly the future of New York City itself. What happened next surprised almost everyone, because instead of tension, there was warmth. Instead of confrontation, there was cooperation. Trump opened by congratulating Mamdani on his victory, calling his campaign incredible and saying he'd beaten some very smart, very tough opponents. He praised Mamdani's ability to connect with voters, to run a disciplined race, to win decisively. And then he said something that really stuck with me. He said, "There's no difference in party. There's no difference in anything. We're going to be helping him to make everybody's dream come true, a strong and very safe New York." Think about that for a second. The President of the United States, a Republican, sitting next to a self-described Democratic Socialist mayor-elect from New York City and publicly committing to help him succeed, not undermining him, not mocking him, not dismissing him, helping him. Now, was that genuine? Was it political theater? Was it strategy on both sides? Maybe all three. But here's what matters. It worked. The optics were positive, the tone was constructive, and for a few minutes it felt like maybe, just maybe, two people who disagree on a lot could still find a way to work together on the things that matter most. Mamdani, for his part, played it smart. He didn't backtrack entirely. He didn't disavow his campaign promises, but he did something more subtle and, frankly, more mature. He acknowledged that he and the president have many disagreements, but he also emphasized that his job is to serve New Yorkers, all of them, and that means pursuing every opportunity, every meeting, every conversation that could lead to better outcomes for the city. He talked about affordability, about the cost of living crisis, about how 1 in 4 New Yorkers live in poverty, and how his administration's focus would be on lifting people out of struggle and giving them a city they can actually afford to live in, not just survive in. And here's the key. He framed working with Trump not as betrayal, but as responsibility, as part of the job, as what a mayor is supposed to do. The reporters, of course, weren't going to let him off that easy. One asked him, point blank, "Are you affirming that you think President Trump is a fascist?" Because, remember, Mamdani had strongly implied exactly that during the campaign. He'd used language that left very little room for interpretation. His answer, he started to deflect, started to give a long, winding response, and then the reporter cut him off and said, "That's okay. You can just say yes." Mamdani paused, smiled awkwardly, and said, "Okay," then added, almost as an afterthought, "It's easier. It's easier than explaining it." The room laughed. It was uncomfortable, but it was also telling, because what Mamdani was really saying in that moment was this: yes, I said those things. Yes, I believed them, or at least I believed them enough to say them. But right now, in this room, with cameras on and a working relationship to build, relitigating that fight doesn't help anyone. Was it a cop-out? Maybe. Was it politically smart? Absolutely. But the tension didn't completely disappear, because while Trump and Mamdani found common ground on affordability, on housing development, on cutting bureaucratic red tape that slows down construction projects, there were still some very real, very deep disagreements lurking just beneath the surface. Public safety, for one. Mamdani has been vocal about his belief that the NYPD's Strategic Response Group, essentially the city's specialized rapid response unit for civil disorder, protests, and large-scale emergencies, should not be deployed to manage protests. He argues it infringes on First Amendment rights and intimidates peaceful demonstrators. Trump, on the other hand, sees public safety as non-negotiable. He made it clear during the meeting, a safe New York is going to be a great New York. If it's not safe, no matter how well we do with pricing, with anything else, it's not going to be a success. And here's where things get tricky for Mamdani, because while he can talk about reform and oversight and protecting civil liberties, all valid concerns, he also has to govern a city where people genuinely worry about crime, where subway riders feel unsafe, where businesses are still recovering from years of instability, where the perception of disorder, whether accurate or not, drives people and investment away. During one interview, Mamdani was asked what he would do if thousands of police officers resigned in protest on his first day in office. Some estimates suggested the number could be as high as several thousand officers walking off the job if they felt unsupported or undermined by the new administration. His response? He said he didn't see that happening, that it was hypothetical, that people were committed to the city and wouldn't abandon it. Which, okay, fair enough. But the follow-up question was obvious, but if it did happen, what's your plan? And he didn't really have one. Or at least, he didn't articulate one. He just reiterated that he didn't think it would happen. Now, as someone who's spent a lot of time thinking about risk management and contingency planning, that answer concerns me. Because hope is not a strategy. Optimism is wonderful, but leaders also have to prepare for worst-case scenarios. They have to have a plan B. And in that moment, it wasn't clear that Mamdani did. Trump, by contrast, was very clear. He wants to see more police on the streets. He wants to see stronger enforcement. He wants to see criminals, especially violent criminals, especially those in the country, illegally removed and prosecuted. And he made it clear that federal support would flow toward mayors who share that priority. So here's where we are. Mamdani walked into that meeting needing something: federal cooperation, funding, goodwill, a path forward that didn't involve constant conflict. And Trump gave it to him, at least publicly. But in exchange, Mamdani had to soften his tone, had to show he was willing to work within the system, had to prove he could be a partner, not just a protest voice. And from Trump's perspective, this was a win too. because it let him project exactly the image he wants heading into the next phase of his presidency. Someone who's willing to work with anyone across any political divide as long as they're serious about solving problems. Someone who's not petty, not vindictive, not obsessed with old grudges. Someone who's focused on results. Whether that image matches reality is a separate question. But politically, optically, strategically, this meeting was a masterclass in how both sides can walk away claiming victory. And yet, the sharpest confrontation of the entire press conference wasn't about police or protesters. It was about taxes, specifically property taxes. And the question came from a reporter who didn't mince words. He asked Mamdani directly, "You talked during the campaign about shifting the property tax burden from minority communities to white-based communities. Are you continuing that race-based taxation policy?" Mamdani's face tightened. He shook his head. He clarified firmly that he was talking about neighborhoods, not races. That the issue was equity in how properties are assessed and taxed, and that some areas had been unfairly overburdened while others had been underassessed for years. He insisted it was about fairness, not racial targeting. But here's the problem. Words matter. And during the campaign, Mamdani had indeed used language that described wealthier, whiter neighborhoods as needing to pay more to support poorer, browner neighborhoods. Whether he intended it that way or not, that's how it was heard. That's how it was reported. And now, in the Oval Office, he was paying the price for that framing. Trump, to his credit, or perhaps to maximize the awkwardness, stayed silent during that exchange. He let Mamdani twist. He let the moment breathe. And the clip, predictably, went viral. Because here's the thing about governing in 2025. Every word you say is recorded, clipped, shared, and analyzed 1,000 different ways. You can't revisit rhetoric from months ago and pretend it doesn't exist. The internet has a long memory, and voters, especially older voters who've seen politicians flip-flop for decades, notice these contradictions. But here's what I found fascinating. Despite these moments of tension, despite the awkward exchanges and the obvious ideological gaps, something else emerged from that meeting. Something most people didn't expect, and many in the media struggled to explain. Genuine points of agreement. Not just polite nodding, not just vague platitudes about working together. Actual, substantive areas where Trump and Mamdani found themselves on surprisingly similar ground. Take housing, for example. Both men agreed that New York City desperately needs more housing supply, that the permitting process is a bureaucratic nightmare, that it takes years, sometimes nearly a decade, to get approval for projects that should take months, that environmental reviews, community board meetings, and layers upon layers of regulation have created a system where building anything has become almost impossible. Mamdani wants to fix this because he believes more housing supply will lower rents and make the city affordable again. Trump wants to fix it because he's a developer at heart and because he knows that economic growth requires construction, jobs, and investment. Different motivations, same conclusion. They also agreed on food prices. During the meeting, Trump talked about how Thanksgiving costs had dropped by about 20 to 25% compared to the previous year, citing grocery chains reporting lower prices on holiday staples. Mamdani nodded along, acknowledging that the cost of living crisis is real and that working families need relief wherever they can get it. And then there was something that honestly surprised me: foreign policy. Specifically, ending what Mamdani called forever wars. During the press conference, he mentioned speaking to voters in his district who supported Trump for exactly two reasons. First, they wanted an end to endless military conflicts abroad. Second, they wanted to stop sending taxpayer dollars to fund what they saw as human rights violations overseas. Now, those are traditionally progressive talking points: anti-war, anti-interventionist, skeptical of military spending. But they're also positions Trump has campaigned on repeatedly. America First means not being the world's policeman. It means bringing troops home. It means questioning why we're spending billions abroad when there are problems at home that need solving. So in that room, for that moment, a Democratic Socialist mayor-elect and a populist Republican president found themselves agreeing on foreign policy. Not on everything, obviously, but on enough that it was notable. Trump even joked, or maybe he was serious, it's always hard to tell that when Bernie Sanders dropped out of the presidential race years ago, a lot of Sanders voters ended up supporting Trump. Because Sanders, like Trump, opposed bad trade deals. He opposed globalization that shipped jobs overseas. He opposed a political establishment that seemed more interested in foreign entanglements than domestic prosperity. Different solutions, sure, but similar frustrations, similar voters, and maybe, just maybe, similar instincts about what's broken in the system. Now, does that mean Trump and Mamdani are secretly best friends? Does it mean all their differences disappeared in a puff of bipartisan smoke? Of course not. But it does mean something important. It means that when two leaders actually sit down, put aside the cameras and the Twitter fights and the cable news narratives, they can sometimes find more common ground than anyone expected. And that, my friends, is a lesson worth remembering. Because in our current political climate, we're so used to treating every disagreement as total war, every policy difference as a moral catastrophe, every opponent as an enemy who must be destroyed. But the truth is, most people, even people who disagree, strongly want similar things: safety, affordability, opportunity, a chance for their kids to do better than they did. The question is whether our leaders are willing to work together to achieve those goals, or whether they'd rather score political points by refusing to cooperate. In this case, at least for now, cooperation won. And the public noticed. The media reaction was swift and predictable. Headlines ranged from Mamdani backtracks on Trump confrontation, to progressive mayor-elect makes peace with president, to did Zoran just sell out. Political commentators were divided. Some praised Mamdani for being pragmatic, for putting New Yorkers ahead of ideology, for recognizing that effective governance requires working with people you don't always agree with. Others accused him of betraying his base, of abandoning his principles, of caving to pressure before he'd even taken office. One analyst put it this way: the question isn't whether Mamdani changed his tune. He obviously did. The question is whether he had any other choice. And I think that's exactly right. Because when you're governing a city of 8.5 million people, when you're managing a budget in the tens of billions, when you're dependent on state and federal cooperation for everything from transit funding to housing programs to public safety grants, you don't have the luxury of being purely ideological. You have to be practical, you have to be strategic, you have to pick your battles. Some of Mamdani's progressive supporters were clearly frustrated. They'd elected him to fight, not to compromise. They'd expected resistance, not collaboration. Social media lit up with criticism from the left, accusing him of going soft, of getting co-opted by the establishment, of losing his nerve. But here's what I think those critics are missing. Fighting for the sake of fighting doesn't help anyone. Resistance without a plan is just noise. And if Mamdani had walked into that meeting, called Trump a fascist to his face, stormed out, and declared war on the White House, what would he have accomplished? A viral moment, sure. A few days of praise from the most partisan corners of the internet. And then what? Then he'd be a mayor, trying to govern a city with no federal support, no goodwill from the White House, no ability to negotiate or compromise or find solutions. He'd be isolated, ineffective, and ultimately unable to deliver on any of his promises. So yes, the optics were awkward. Yes, the walk back was uncomfortable. But in the long run, keeping the door open might be the smartest thing Mamdani could have done. Now, let's talk about what all this actually means for New Yorkers. Because at the end of the day, politics is just a means to an end. What matters is whether people's lives get better. If this new relationship between Mamdani and Trump holds, if they actually follow through on the things they discussed, New Yorkers could see some real benefits. More federal funding for infrastructure projects, support for housing development, cooperation on public safety initiatives, streamlined approvals for construction, lower barriers to economic growth. Those aren't abstract policy points. They translate into jobs, into safer streets, into more affordable homes, into a city that works better for everyone. On the other hand, there are risks. If Mamdani softens too much, If he compromises away the core promises that got him elected, he could lose the trust of the very people who put him in office. Progressive voters didn't elect him to be a moderate. They elected him to be bold, to challenge the status quo, to fight for transformative change. So he's walking a tightrope. He needs to cooperate enough to govern effectively, but resist enough to maintain his identity and his mandate. That's not easy. And history is full of politicians who fell off that tightrope in one direction or the other, either becoming so compromised they stood for nothing, or becoming so rigid they accomplished nothing. The next few months will tell us which side Mamdani lands on, but for now, at least, he's threading the needle. And there's a bigger story here too, because this meeting wasn't just about New York City, it was about a pattern that's emerging across the country. Democrats in blue cities and blue states are starting to realize that some of their positions, especially on public safety, on crime, on border security, on fiscal responsibility, are political liabilities. Voters are frustrated. They're tired of seeing disorder. They're tired of watching their cost of living skyrocket. They're tired of policies that sound compassionate but create chaos. And so, quietly, many Democratic leaders are recalibrating, not abandoning their values necessarily, but adjusting their approach, being more pragmatic, more willing to listen to concerns they might have dismissed a few years ago. Mamdani's pivot is part of that broader shift, and Trump knows it. He's using meetings like this to position himself as the adult in the room, the deal maker, the guy who's willing to work with anyone, even his critics, as long as they're serious about solving problems. Is it genuine? Maybe. Is it also brilliant politics? Absolutely. Because every time Trump sits down with a Democrat and they shake hands and smile and talk about cooperation, it undercuts the narrative that he's a divisive extremist. It makes him look reasonable, presidential, effective, and for Democrats, it creates a dilemma. Do they refuse to work with him and risk looking petty and obstructionist, or do they cooperate and risk looking like they've abandoned their principles? There's no easy answer, but the fact that the question is even being asked shows how much the political landscape has shifted. So where does all this leave us? Well, Zohran Mamdani walked into his mayoral race as a firebrand. He promised revolution. He energized young progressives and working-class voters who felt ignored by the political establishment. He won decisively, carrying a clear mandate for change. But then reality hit. The money wasn't there. The governor said no. The federal funding was at risk. The city's challenges were bigger and more complex than any campaign speech could capture. And suddenly, the choice wasn't between bold action and timid compromise. It was between pragmatic cooperation and ineffective isolation. Mamdani chose cooperation. Maybe reluctantly, maybe strategically, maybe even cynically, but he chose it. And in doing so, he gave himself and New York City a fighting chance. Trump, for his part, took the meeting seriously. He could have been dismissive, condescending, petty. He could have used the opportunity to humiliate a political opponent. Instead, he was gracious, complimentary, constructive. Whether that reflects personal growth, political calculation, or just good mood that day, I couldn't tell you. But it worked. The result was a meeting that almost no one predicted and that very few people know quite what to make of. A progressive mayor-elect and a populist president, sitting together, finding common ground, and promising to work together for the good of America's largest city. Will it last? Will they actually follow through? Or will old tensions resurface the moment the cameras stop rolling and the real negotiations begin? Time will tell. But for one afternoon in November 2025, inside the Oval Office, something unexpected happened. Two leaders who were supposed to be enemies acted like partners. Two men who had spent